Socrates was a philosopher who lived in Athens, ancient Greece, about 400 years before the birth of Christ. You've probably heard his name, even if you know nothing else about him. You may also know that the other citizens of Athens put him to death because he went around asking a lot of challenging questions, needling people, irritating them with questions about their actions and their beliefs that they didn't care to answer. Well, it's a remarkable fact that for the past 24 centuries, very few thinkers in the Western tradition have been able to avoid having to come at some point to grips with Socrates and his life and his death. It's even more interesting that Socrates, so far as we know, never actually wrote down a single word. He strolled around the town, embarrassing prominent people with his questions. He liked to say that the only superiority that he ever claimed was that he was absolutely certain that he was ignorant, but he found that people believed that they knew all kinds of things, and in that, he was superior to them. Now, one of the young aristocrats who got a big charge out of following Socrates around the town was a young wrestler named Plato, maybe the first scholar-athlete. So Plato wrote a series of dialogues after Socrates died that featured his hero in the principal role. The early dialogues do seem to reflect for us this business of walking around asking these difficult questions that no one can answer. Later, in the later dialogues, Plato begins to use Socrates as a mouthpiece or as someone who represents the kinds of new questions that Plato himself began to ask under Socrates' inspiration. To give you some indication of how expert readers over time have understood Plato's thought and its central importance in the tradition, the great 20th century philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of Western thought is nothing more than a series of footnotes to Plato. Quite a claim. And remember that it was Plato's encounter with Socrates that inspired all of Plato's thought. Now, Plato's single most important dialogue, with Socrates as the hero, is a dialogue called The Republic. And in it, Plato tries to formulate two basic, fundamental, and universal questions. What's the best sort of life for a human being? And beyond that, what's the best society for producing the conditions under which human beings could live that kind of life? These two questions give the book the first mark of greatness that I was discussing, which is the Republic addresses permanent and universal questions, ones that might puzzle you as much as they did Socrates and Plato. First, their thinking stays very much alive in Greece and Rome for 400 years until the coming of Christ, and beyond that for many centuries more. If you happen to be a Christian, what you think of as Christianity, the very concepts and ideas that form the basis for Christianity, actually turn out to owe a great deal to Plato and Aristotle. Virtually everything that Christianity teaches about God, about human nature, about human fulfillment, arises from what the historians of religion like to call the marriage of Jerusalem and Athens. That is, the marriage of Greek and Jewish thinking. One big moment for this process comes about 8 centuries after Plato and Aristotle, 4 centuries after Christ, when a man named St. Augustine writes a truly monumental work in the history of Western thought, a real classic, The City of God. He writes this book just as the Roman Empire is collapsing around his ears from invasions of barbarians. Augustine was very influenced by Platonic thinking, even though he wasn't all that familiar directly with Plato's works. And he sets the course of Christian thinking for a very long time. In fact, if you're knowledgeable about the history of Christian doctrine or Christian theology, you'll know that Augustine is influential right up to the current moment. Then another 800 years after St. Augustine, a priest around the year 1250 named Thomas Aquinas rediscovers many of the lost works of Aristotle. To put this very briefly, he puts together the thought of Aristotle with the thought of Augustine, comes up with a new synthesis for Christian thinking, and it turns out to be a game changer. The result is, for the most part, what the Roman Catholic Church teaches to this very day. St. Thomas Aquinas is the primary Orthodox theologian of Catholicism. Meanwhile, the Italian poet Dante, who lives one generation after Aquinas, reads Aquinas, is influenced by his work, and as one of the 3 or 4 greatest poets ever to live, presents us with his own view of human nature, fulfillment, and human destiny when he writes his 3 epic poems about hell, purgatory, and heaven. You've probably heard of Dante's Inferno. So now fast forward another 250 years, and we come to about the year 1500, Martin Luther in Germany. Now, Luther gets very angry about a lot of things that are happening in the Catholic Church. He goes back and rips Aquinas apart. He trashes Aristotle, and he returns for his inspiration to the game-changing works of St. Augustine and St. Paul. By doing this, Luther also starts a process that splinters Christianity into a million pieces. Game changers. Another 100 or so years after Luther, we have John Milton. Milton is an English poet. He takes his inspiration from the reforming of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, and he writes the greatest epic poem in the English language, Paradise Lost. It gives his own picture, the Protestant picture, of human nature, human history, human destiny, God's will. So if you happen to be a Catholic and you believe that the Catholic Church teaches the same thing always and everywhere and has from the very beginning, or if you're an evangelical Protestant and you believe that all of your own views come directly from a plain, straightforward reading of New Testament texts, in either case you could not be more mistaken. The very teachings of the Catholic Church, or the very ways that a Protestant Christian interprets the words of the Bible and Scripture, results from speculations and collisions taking place among ideas that involve Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, St. Paul, Dante, Martin Luther, and Milton. Here's a very small example of something quite specific. Many Christians believe that Satan, the devil, was once a great archangel, in fact, that he was the highest of all the angels, and that his name was Lucifer, and that he rebelled against God in heaven before the creation of the entire world. Later, he successfully tempted our first parents, Adam and Eve, to eat an apple in the Garden of Eden. There's actually remarkably little in the Hebrew Scriptures about Satan, and what's there does not happen to include these beliefs. Satan, as we imagine him, is actually a much later invention, and he's not thought of as either a fallen angel or even fully identified with the serpent in the garden who tempted Adam and Eve to taste the fruit until 4 centuries after the life of Christ. Augustine has a lot to do with who Satan becomes. And the picture that you yourself may have in your mind of a rebel angel, a war in heaven between the good angels and the bad angels, well, that's something that John Milton imagined for us when he published Paradise Lost in 1667.